Leonard Pierce was a brilliant software architect. Simon Adler was the whistleblower who vanished just before the truth unraveled. And Captain Harold Weston was the experienced pilot who had no idea his aircraft was being programmed to crash. Their lives intersected on the morning Flight 226 fell from the sky, an event the world believed was a tragic accident. But when investigators finally checked the control system, they uncovered a chilling truth: the plane didn't fail. It obeyed. It was a foggy Monday morning in the quiet town of Clearfield, Oregon. The kind of morning where headlights barely pierced the haze and everything seemed wrapped in silence. By 6:00 a.m., the roads were slick with dew, and the airport runway was soaked in a thin veil of mist. Flight 226, a small regional jet operated by Pacific Crest Airlines, was on its final descent after a routine 90-minute trip from Boise. The aircraft was well maintained, the pilots were experienced, and the weather, while foggy, was still considered safe for landing. At exactly 6:17 a.m., air traffic control lost contact with the plane. Moments later, a loud boom echoed through the trees on the outskirts of town. Several residents who lived near the forested hills thought it might have been thunder, until the emergency scanners came alive with reports of a possible crash. Within minutes, first responders from Clearfield County were rushing toward the signal from the plane's emergency locator beacon, which had activated the instant the aircraft went down. The crash site was nearly inaccessible, tucked deep within a ravine, surrounded by dense pine trees. What rescuers found when they arrived was horrifying smoldering debris, broken fuselage twisted around trees, luggage scattered across the forest floor, and a silence that confirmed what they already feared. There were no survivors. 38 passengers and 4 crew members had all perished on impact. The wreckage was so badly burned and torn apart that identifying bodies would take weeks. News of the crash hit the town hard. Clearfield was small, and while not everyone knew someone on the flight, the tragedy felt personal. Among the dead were locals, a beloved high school chemistry teacher heading to a conference, a young couple returning from their honeymoon, a single mother of 2 who had just started a new job, and a retired Air Force colonel known around town for his volunteer work. Their photos would soon appear on front pages and news broadcasts across the state, accompanied by candlelight vigils and grief-stricken interviews. In the immediate aftermath, authorities focused on likely causes. The weather, though not extreme, had the potential to confuse instruments or obscure visibility. Perhaps it had contributed to pilot error. The airline released a statement expressing sorrow and promising full cooperation with the investigation. Experts on the news speculated about a possible sudden mechanical failure. The crash, they said, might remain a mystery for weeks or even months until the black box recorders were retrieved and analyzed. The wreckage was cordoned off, guarded around the clock by both local police and federal agents. Investigators from the National Transportation Safety Board arrived within 48 hours, setting up a command post near the edge of the ravine. Drones were used to map the debris field, and teams with climbing gear worked to recover key parts of the aircraft. It was a grueling task. Every bolt, circuit board, and wire had to be catalogued. In the midst of scorched trees and shattered aluminum, they searched for answers. The initial theory, that the crash was a tragic accident caused by weather, was widely accepted. After all, the flight had been completely normal until its final moments. Air traffic control logs showed a routine landing request. The pilots had communicated no concerns. The plane wasn't off course. There was no explosion in the air. To most observers, it looked like the kind of heartbreaking but straightforward aviation disaster that occasionally makes headlines. Nature, fate, or simple human error, these things happened. But not everyone was convinced. One of the NTSB analysts assigned to the case, a data systems specialist with a reputation for being meticulous, noticed something that bothered her. The flight path data showed a subtle anomaly just before the crash. Something about the angle of descent and the timing of the autopilot's last input. She flagged it for further analysis, even though the rest of her team believed it was likely just a result of turbulence or delayed response by the crew. As the media focused on memorials and the public grieved, the black boxes sat in a locked transport case, waiting to be flown to Washington, D.C. for decoding. Inside them were the final conversations of the flight crew and every detail of the plane's systems in the last hours of its journey. No one yet realized that buried deep in those recordings was a secret that would unravel everything they thought they knew about Flight 226. The recovery of the black box recorders from Flight 226 took nearly a week. Hidden beneath layers of wreckage and scorched debris, they were finally located by a team of investigators who combed the crash site inch by inch. Despite the intense heat of the impact and the brutal force of the crash, both the cockpit voice recorder and the flight data recorder were found intact. Charred, dented, but still functional. They were immediately shipped to the NTSB's headquarters in Washington, D.C., where specialists began the painstaking process of decoding the final moments of the doomed flight. The cockpit voice recorder was reviewed first. Investigators listened carefully to the final 30 minutes of audio, which captured the routine procedures of the crew. The pilot, Captain Harold Weston, and his co-pilot, First Officer Jenna Liu, were calm and professional throughout. There was no sign of distress, confusion, or conflict. The two of them communicated normally with air traffic control, reviewed landing checklists, and even commented briefly on the weather. Their voices gave no indication that anything was wrong, until the very end. In the final 30 seconds of the recording, the tone shifted. There was a sudden alarm tone, followed by the sound of the autopilot disconnecting, and then a sharp gasp. The last sound was a chaotic mix of rumbling, static, and one clipped sentence from Captain Weston that cut off mid-word. Although chilling, the cockpit voice recorder didn't provide a clear explanation for the crash. The pilots appeared unaware of any problem until it was far too late. There were no system warnings, no engine trouble, and no indication of external interference. It was as though something unseen had taken control, something faster than human reaction. The flight data recorder proved to be more revealing. It documented every movement of the aircraft, altitude, airspeed, pitch, throttle settings, and hundreds of other variables recorded every second. For the first hour and a half of the flight, everything was entirely normal. The aircraft followed its route, maintained a steady speed, and responded perfectly to control inputs. But at precisely 6:14 a.m., something strange occurred. Without any command from the pilots, the autopilot system executed an abrupt maneuver, a sharp bank to the right, followed by a steep nose-down dive. The plane began descending at a rate far faster than a typical landing. The pilots attempted to respond, and the data showed they pulled back on the yoke and tried to cut the throttle. But the system didn't respond. Despite their efforts, the aircraft maintained its deadly trajectory. This single data point triggered alarm bells for the investigators. Autopilot systems are designed to be overridden by manual controls. Even in the event of a software glitch, disengaging the autopilot should return full control to the pilots. Yet here, the opposite had occurred. The autopilot had not only failed to disengage but had actively resisted manual inputs. It was as if the plane had decided its own fate, ignoring the frantic efforts of the crew. The team dug deeper into the logs. They examined the software version running on the aircraft's flight control computer and compared it to the airline's standard version. That's when they noticed a discrepancy. The software on Flight 226 had been updated just 4 days before the crash. The update had been logged by Altura Aerotech, the company responsible for maintaining the airline's avionics systems. On paper, it was a minor patch, routine maintenance designed to improve system stability. Nothing about the update had been flagged as risky or experimental. It had been signed off and pushed live without incident. Still, the timing was suspicious. A routine software update, followed by a catastrophic failure days later. The lead systems analyst requested the source code used in the update. She also began tracing the patch history to find out who authored the change and whether it had been tested properly before deployment. Meanwhile, the other investigators began interviewing technicians, engineers, and company executives to understand the approval process. Most of the team still leaned toward a technical malfunction, an unforeseen bug, perhaps caused by hardware damage or a rare set of input conditions. But the lead analyst wasn't convinced. She had seen enough to know that software doesn't just glitch in such a specific and targeted way. Someone, she suspected, had written the code that caused this crash. And if that were true, then Flight 226 hadn't gone down by accident. It had been programmed to fall. 3 weeks had passed since the crash of Flight 226, and while public interest had begun to shift toward other stories, the investigation behind closed doors had grown more intense. The discovery that the autopilot system executed a fatal maneuver without pilot input had sent shockwaves through the National Transportation Safety Board. It wasn't just unusual, it was nearly unprecedented. Commercial aircraft are designed with layers of redundancy and strict software protocols, making them resistant to unauthorized control. Yet something had overridden those safety measures aboard Flight 226. And now the focus shifted to finding out how that was even possible. Investigators zeroed in on the most recent software update, the one pushed 4 days before the crash. Altura Aerotech, the avionics contractor responsible for maintaining the airline's systems, had signed off on the update as part of a scheduled maintenance cycle. It had been implemented across several aircraft, including Flight 226. According to company records, the update was designed to fix a minor synchronization issue between the autopilot and the aircraft's onboard diagnostic system. On paper, the patch looked harmless. But beneath the surface, something was wrong. The NTSB submitted a request to Altura for access to the source code used in the update. The company cooperated, providing documents, deployment logs, and a list of the engineers who worked on the patch. Everything appeared clean, at first. The change logs showed nothing suspicious. There were no red flags in the version control history. But one investigator, a forensic software analyst named Erin Vale, wasn't satisfied. She had a reputation for noticing what others missed. She began comparing the update line by line with a previous stable version, combing through thousands of lines of code manually. That's when she found something strange, a subroutine buried deep within the autopilot logic, written in a way that made it nearly invisible. It was disguised to look like a diagnostic tool, activated only under very specific conditions, a particular altitude, a certain heading, a narrow window of time. If those conditions were met, the subroutine would take control of the aircraft and execute a rapid descent, just like what had happened to Flight 226. Even more disturbing, the subroutine was designed to resist manual override. The pilot's inputs wouldn't matter once it was activated. Realizing the implications, Erin flagged the finding to the rest of the investigative team. This wasn't a random failure. This was deliberate. The presence of the hidden subroutine changed everything. Someone had planted a command into the aircraft system that directly caused the crash. It was not just sabotage. It was murder. The team went back to the deployment records and began narrowing down who had access to this portion of the code. There were only a handful of engineers with that level of clearance at Altura Aerotech. Among them was a name that stood out, not because he had done anything suspicious recently, but because of what had happened just before the crash. Simon Adler, a senior software engineer, had abruptly resigned 2 weeks prior. He hadn't submitted a formal letter or given notice. One day he was at his desk, and the next, his credentials were revoked and his workstation cleared. Attempts to contact Simon through official channels failed. His phone was disconnected, his apartment empty, and his online profiles wiped clean. It was as if he had vanished. That only deepened suspicions. With the help of federal agents, they traced a credit card transaction to a hardware store in Idaho. From there, they followed a paper trail that led to a small cabin tucked into the edge of the Sawtooth Mountains. It was off-grid, no phone service, no internet. They approached cautiously, unsure what they'd find. To their surprise, Simon didn't run. He opened the door, thin and pale, looking like he hadn't slept in days. When the agents identified themselves, he didn't protest. Instead, he handed them a weathered manila envelope and a USB drive. "Everything you're looking for is on that," he said. "But be careful. Someone didn't want this to be found." Inside the envelope were printed emails, system logs, and handwritten notes showing Simon's discovery of the hidden subroutine weeks before the crash. He had reported it to a supervisor, only to be told to ignore it. He was later instructed to sign off on the patch anyway. When he refused, pressure mounted. He resigned before the situation could escalate, taking his findings with him. What Simon had exposed was not just a line of rogue code. It was a deliberate act by someone who had the knowledge and access to orchestrate a disaster, and the intent to hide it beneath layers of technical misdirection. The trail now pointed toward a different name. Buried in the metadata of the subroutine's creation, Leonard Pierce, a senior architect with deep access to Altura's software infrastructure. A man with no criminal record. A man who had been with the company for over a decade. A man with a personal tragedy in his past, One that, as investigators would soon learn, gave him a powerful motive for revenge. The evidence taken from Simon Adler's USB drive was more than just a technical lead. It was the missing piece that connected everything. For weeks, investigators had been operating under the assumption that the fatal crash of Flight 226 was either a tragic malfunction or an act of gross negligence. But the documents and debug logs Simon preserved told a different story. This was a premeditated act. The code had been inserted with precision, disguised as part of a routine patch, and timed to activate only under specific conditions. Whoever wrote it had not only expert-level knowledge of the aircraft's systems, but also an understanding of how to mask their intent behind layers of legitimate-looking commands. Simon's handwritten notes included a timeline, and on that timeline was one name circled multiple times: Leonard Pierce. He wasn't just another engineer. He was a senior software architect at Altura Aerotech, one of the original developers of the Autopilot control system used in that fleet. He had access to legacy code, deployment servers, and internal testing environments. Unlike junior engineers who were restricted to certain layers of the system, Leonard had full administrative rights. If anyone could insert hidden commands without raising suspicion, it was him. But Leonard had always been a model employee. According to his personnel file, he was meticulous, reliable, and well-respected by his colleagues. He had never received a disciplinary warning, and his performance reviews consistently ranked him among the top of his department. Outwardly, he had no reason to sabotage a plane full of innocent people. There was no evidence of financial stress, no history of mental illness, no affiliations with extremist ideologies. But as investigators dug deeper into Leonard's past, a different picture began to emerge. 5 years earlier, Leonard's wife, Melanie Pierce, had been a flight attendant aboard a commercial jet that collided midair with a cargo plane over northern Utah. The crash had killed everyone on board, including Melanie. The official report had blamed a combination of human error and a miscommunication between air traffic control and the pilots. Leonard had publicly stayed silent about the incident, but private records showed he had filed multiple complaints with the FAA, claiming that the airline's poor safety culture had contributed to the crash. Each complaint had been dismissed or resolved without further action. After Melanie's death, Leonard began to withdraw. He worked longer hours, declined social invitations, and refused to participate in company events. He requested to transfer to the avionics software team full-time, specifically to the group responsible for flight control algorithms. The move was approved without question. No one suspected that his motivation was anything other than grief and a desire to stay busy. Now, however, the pieces fit differently. Leonard hadn't just buried himself in work. He had been planning something. Simon's recovered documents showed that the code used to bring down Flight 226 had been written months in advance and tested in a simulated environment. It had been carefully modified over time, making sure it would blend into the official update process. The activation parameters were chosen with eerie precision. Flight 226 didn't just happen to meet them. It was selected for them. The flight number, the route, and even the time of day bore resemblance to the one Melanie had been on when she died. It became clear that Leonard had waited for the perfect opportunity. By embedding his sabotage within a legitimate software update, he avoided external detection. By using conditions so specific, the likelihood of accidental activation was virtually non-existent. And by resisting manual override, he ensured that even the best, trained pilots would be powerless once the subroutine began its execution. It was a calculated act of revenge, designed to make a statement no one would understand unless they knew exactly where to look. A federal warrant was issued for Leonard Pierce's arrest. Surveillance teams were dispatched to his last known address, a modest house in a suburban neighborhood outside Portland. When agents arrived, Leonard was at home, seated at a desk surrounded by schematics, hard drives, and printed flight plans. He didn't resist. He didn't deny anything. In fact, when presented with the warrant, he reportedly nodded slowly and said, "It was never about them. It was about what they let happen." As agents searched the property, they found a disturbing collection of materials, diagrams of various aircraft systems, internal memos from the airline involved in his wife's crash, and dozens of handwritten notebooks filled with angry, detailed criticisms of aviation safety standards. But most chilling of all was a whiteboard covered in numbers, dates, and call signs. evidence of other flights he had considered targeting. Flight 226 wasn't the only one. It was simply the one he chose to make his message permanent. What had seemed like an inexplicable accident was now exposed as a cold, calculated act of vengeance. Leonard Pierce had turned his grief into a weapon, using his position and skills to carry out a crime so complex that no one suspected it until it was too late. The arrest of Leonard Pierce sent shockwaves through the aviation industry. News outlets across the country scrambled to cover the unfolding story, with headlines proclaiming the stunning truth. The crash of Flight 226 had been no accident. It was the result of deliberate sabotage. For the families of the victims, the revelation was like reopening a fresh wound. They had grieved for loved ones lost in what they were told was a tragic accident. Now they were forced to process the fact that those lives had been stolen, carefully and intentionally, by a man fueled by grief and revenge. Federal prosecutors moved swiftly, charging Leonard with 42 counts of first-degree murder, conspiracy, and multiple federal violations related to aviation sabotage. The case was unprecedented in its complexity. It wasn't a bomb, a hijacking, or a physical attack. Instead, it was a silent, digital weapon. A few hundred lines of code inserted into an update, disguised so well that even seasoned engineers hadn't noticed. And that was what made it so terrifying. The crash of Flight 226 proved that the future of aviation threats wasn't just mechanical or explosive. It could be invisible, buried in ones and zeros, activated without a single touch. In the weeks that followed, investigators continued to comb through Leonard's files. What they uncovered painted a picture of a man consumed by quiet obsession. After the death of his wife, Leonard had grown increasingly frustrated with what he saw as systemic failures in airline safety. His complaints had been ignored, his warnings brushed aside. Rather than find peace, he internalized the injustice, nurturing it until it hardened into something cold and methodical. He didn't lash out impulsively. He planned. He calculated. He turned his grief into a manifesto, one he etched into the heart of an airplane's control system. The software subroutine Leonard created was eventually dubbed Command Echo by investigators. It was unlike anything the forensic teams had seen before. It mimicked internal diagnostic calls, initiated a sequence of seemingly routine commands, and used conditional triggers that could only be activated under precise circumstances. Once it began, it locked out human control and initiated a fatal descent profile. It even logged false data to the system, making it appear to air traffic control as if the descent had been pilot-directed. It was elegant, chilling, and almost undetectable. The trial began 6 months after the arrest, with Leonard pleading not guilty by reason of mental defect. His defense argued that years of unresolved trauma and professional isolation had caused a psychological break. Expert witnesses debated whether Leonard fully understood the consequences of his actions. But the prosecution countered with evidence of meticulous planning, deliberate concealment, and a deep understanding of how the crash would unfold. The jury listened as software experts described the steps Leonard took to hide his code. They saw the emails where he pressured colleagues to skip checks. They read pages from his notebooks, some of which included flight rosters and handwritten notes about acceptable targets. In the end, the jury deliberated for only 4 hours. Leonard Pierce was found guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced him to life in federal prison without the possibility of parole. But even as justice was delivered in the courtroom, the story wasn't over. The crash of Flight 226 forced a reckoning across the aviation and software industries. Airlines, aircraft manufacturers, and regulatory bodies were compelled to re-examine how software updates were tested and deployed. A new layer of oversight was introduced for third-party contractors. Autonomous systems, once trusted without question, were now viewed with a necessary skepticism. Every autopilot, every update, every patch, each was scrutinized with fresh eyes. The FAA issued emergency mandates requiring external code audits for all commercial aircraft systems, and dozens of outdated or unverified software modules were retired within months. For the families of the victims, closure came in fragments. Memorials were held again, this time not for an accident, but in remembrance of a crime. A plaque was placed at the crash site, listing the names of all 42 souls lost. Some families found solace in advocacy, pushing for reforms that might prevent another such tragedy. Others simply tried to move on, haunted by the knowledge that someone had chosen to end their loved ones' lives with the click of a keyboard. Years later, a documentary aired detailing the events of Flight 226. It was titled "Everyone Thought It Was an Accident," until they checked the control system. It told the story of grief turned lethal, of hidden code and quiet obsession, and of how one man's pain echoed through the lives of so many. It was a reminder that in an age of technology, danger doesn't always come with a sound or a warning. Sometimes, it hides in silence until it's far too late.